This presentation is called Xochitl, Planting the Seed, Redefining Student Discipline Practices within American Indian Communities. Nimitztlapalos, Nimitzita, Nanitoka, Leroy F. Size, Niewa Atlishko, Yanquit, Mexico, Nanimiskotia, Denver, Colorado, Noteish Matkawa, Rosales, Size, Gonzalez, Juan Padilla, Nocalpishkawa, Padilla Size, Namechishmati. Hello, my name is Leroy F. Size. I am from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I now live in Denver, Colorado. My familial affiliations consist of Rosales, Size, Gonzalez, and Padilla extended families. My immediate family is the Padilla Size family. Naman Nitekiti, Golden, Colorado, por Jeffco Public Schools. Juan Nitekiti, Fort Collins, Colorado, upon Colorado State University. I work in Golden, Colorado for Jeffco Public Schools, and I also work in Fort Collins, Colorado at Colorado State University. Within Jeffco Public Schools, I am the program coordinator for their Title VI Indian Education program. And within Colorado State University, I'm an adjunct professor teaching in Native American history. Making sure we use our time wisely, I'm going to give you a quick rundown of today's agenda. Once we get settled in, we will begin with me describing punitive approaches to student discipline amongst public school districts across the United States. I will then follow up with a discussion on the impact of punitive discipline approaches on the general student population. Then I will discuss the impact of punitive practices on American Indian and Alaska Native youth. This will include a brief description of how punitive approaches to student discipline also impacts tribal sovereignty. Moving on, I will explain to the audience what restorative practices consist of, followed by a definition of restorative circles. A fourth segment to the presentation will include a description of indigenous knowledge practices and discussing collaborative approaches where both indigenous knowledge and restorative practices work together. Finally, I will conclude with a brief description of relational accountability and how we are all related. My intention today is to give you, the audience, a better understanding of how indigenous knowledge and restorative practices have many similarities that can be beneficial in servicing the disciplinary needs of school districts who are serving American Indian and Alaska Native youth, while at the same time meeting the needs of the community and making sure that we further maintain tribal sovereignty. So knowing that, there is an add value between indigenous knowledge practices and restorative practices engaging in collaborative methods. So a punitive approach to discipline means that when dealing with disciplinary matters in our schools, we are taking the traditional Western approach of using suspensions, expulsions, and even pressing charges on students as a consequence to a violation of the Student Conduct Code or even city, state, and federal laws. And while there are some instances which we cannot avoid punitive action, a good majority of instances we can actually avoid suspensions or expulsions, mainly because we know that this does not alleviate a negative behavior by the offender, nor does it bring closure to the victim. Over 40 years of research on punitive methods has identified that such practices are harmful to historically disadvantaged youth, such as students of color, LGBTQ2 students, students who speak English as a second language, as well as students who are in a lower socioeconomic status. So not only does punitive measures impact school districts' general population, but it also impacts schools that serve American Indian and Alaska Native students. Punitive practices have a profound impact on American Indian and Alaska Native students when it comes to closing the achievement gap. Specifically, it perpetuates higher dropout rates, it decreases school readiness, and further clears pathways for the school-to-prison pipeline. This also means that cycles of violence and historical trauma are further enabled amongst indigenous communities within the United States. Punitive practices are also a direct threat to tribal sovereignty in that it limits tribal members and their government's right to self-determination and ignores the fact that within our treaty rights, Land was given up in exchange to gain access to an equitable education. What are restorative practices? What is restorative practices? They are the opposite of punitive methods. Restorative practices cannot be defined as a curriculum, mainly because it is more so a philosophy. And its philosophy can actually be, its roots can be traced back to indigenous communities around the world. So for mainstream research, most often we actually can trace it back and look to research that defines it coming from communities in New Zealand, the Maori communities in New Zealand. Restorative practices also is very intentional in focusing its efforts in developing positive relationships and gaining agency for community members. This means that individuals begin to take responsibility for their actions and their life, meaning we no longer have a system, an institution who's taking control of how people are interacting with each other. It's not a controlled environment. This also requires that all involved are identifying themselves being part of a community and knowing that we are all in it together. What are restorative circles? So one specific tool within the restorative toolbox is the use of restorative circles. Restorative circles are proactive ceremonies that cultivate a culture of belonging and allow for participants to be seen and heard. On another note, when dealing with any disruption inside a community relationship, belonging and having the chance to be seen and heard can be pathways to mending relationships. Class meetings are also functional practices that can build group identity, collective agency, interconnectedness, and affiliation. So meetings and circles do not also have to be formal, but they can be informal measure that can be designed according to the mood of the class or group at that specific time and place. They do not always suggest repairing something that has been broken within the community. So they can just be used strictly in a proactive way. So Tlato Yawili, or indigenous knowledge practices, are methodological approaches rooted within indigenous ways of knowing and being. This means that approaches used from a cultural perspective are rooted within the creation and emergence or origin stories of indigenous peoples of a specific land base and language. A great example of indigenous knowledge practices is the Nahuatl concept of Tlakawapawalisli Neishtlamachlisli. This means to strengthen people emotionally and give them wisdom. Within the Indian education program I coordinate, this is practiced as a framework for how we serve our students, families, community, and schools. This term, Nawishinachli, or four seeds, focus on belonging, mastery, independence, and generosity. If these seeds are nurtured properly, we can then develop and grow our community to be able to live a successful life that takes into account our cultural, morals, values, and philosophies, while at the same time being able to gain mobility and access the tools required to be successful amongst outside communities. So this knowledge system requires that we look at four specific phases in the development of a student, family, or even community. We can identify this from a corn stalk when looking at the growth and development of corn stalk. So the first is called Shotinitia, planting a seed, where we call our ancestors and support services from the community to focus their attention on our development or the student's development. The second phase is Tlaselia, or the seed struggling to sprout. This is when we must focus our efforts on our prayer or intentions and the energy from gaining access to community resources. Oftentimes, this phase is when in a student's academic career is when they are in middle school and they are not only beginning to deal with academic challenges, but they're also beginning to deal with life challenges. If we have given the right attention to our seeds, we can then move on to the third phase, which is tlacuepone, or giving thanks to all living things for the relationship we have with them. So most of our students are at this point in the model are in high school, and independence is a huge part of their lives. If we have nurtured and taken care appropriately of our seeds, meaning our students, we can afford to let them discover life and its lessons on their own, and without having to really worry about any mistakes they make being too detrimental to their well-being. Finally, the fourth phase is called ometeo, or dual creative energy. This is a time when students are taught about generosity, and they engage in the act of the giveaway, the ceremony of a giveaway. So this means that whether it's a specific tangible item, or even if it's just knowledge, or just showing love to somebody, because they have been watered by the community, they have been nurtured by the community, they now know that they have to give back. They are now creating these new cycles of positivity, or of looking out for each other, relational accountability. And these are the types of indigenous knowledge practices that can greatly inform other powerful models of support, such as restorative practices, by integrating, or at least finding ways where they can work together in unison. So, Leroy Littlebear, a native scholar from the Blood Tribe of Alberta, Canada, speaks to the idea that both the Western world and indigenous peoples are in a place where our knowledge systems can complement each other. Where one perspective falls short, another perspective can support. So today, the conversation I bring to you is, how can indigenous knowledge and restorative practices work side by side? I've given you, the audience, a brief understanding that we know punitive approaches now are detrimental to all students with long-term impact. And more than likely, this accounts for a numerous amount of people caught up within the criminal justice system or within mental health care. So knowing that there are approaches like restorative practices and indigenous educational models, as well as indigenous knowledge practices, how can we incorporate them both into serving our youth? And more importantly, for those working in the field of Indian education, how can we use these practices to better meet the needs of American Indian and Alaskan Native youth? How do we use this tool as a way to promote tribal sovereignty and self-determination? Amongst Native communities around the world, there's this concept of we are all related. In some communities, it's considered in Lakesh. In other communities, Sanse Tohan. I know within the Lakota community, because here in Denver, Colorado, there's a significant Lakota population, they use the term Mitakuye o Yasin. But whatever term you use, what it's identifying is this form of relational accountability. And in whatever pathways we move to use in discipline amongst our students, or we can even call it student learning, we must be very aware that whatever action we perpetuate on our youth, at some point it's going to come back around. We will have to take into account for everything we have done. When we do great things, that cycle continues. And the same goes for the not so good things that we might apply within an everyday school setting. So knowing this, let's make sure that we move in a way that teaches youth to have foresight rather than hindsight. Meaning, let's think about our actions. That way we don't have to reflect on them afterwards. And through the community and through Native elders, I have always been taught the best way to teach our youth about something is to exemplify it within our actions. So, knowing that what I do today will impact me tomorrow, who I influence today will change the world tomorrow. Thank you for your time. Tlaxcamati. O Meteo, gracias.